The Athletic.
We talk Red Bull's Imola struggles and the winners and losers in F1's development war, as well as tackling your questions on Williams being overweight, F1 simulator use, the challenges of Monaco, closed rear wheels, and tyre compound balance shifts. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show, squeezed in between the F1 races at Imola and Monaco, and certainly the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix weekend threw up plenty of technical talking points that we can get into. I'm Edd Straw, but the main attraction as always is Gary Anderson, who is here with me. Gary, Imola and Monaco must be old favourites of yours.
Yeah, they are. Monaco, yeah, it's a very good one. It's coming up, so it's one of those interesting races. It's completely different from the rest of the season. It used to be really a bit of a handful whenever you weren't down in the pits. The garages weren't there. You had to go to the car park to sort the cars out and stuff. It's probably a lot easier logistically now because you're down in the garage. You've got all your stuff there, so you're much better off this year. But going back to Imola, I thought what it was great to see was the fact of gravel being thrown up, grass being cut by racing cars. That old school track where you can't run off. You don't have to really worry too much about track limitations and track penalties because, these cars are 2 meters wide. If you have gravel that's, 1.6, 1.7 meters from the white line as such, it's self-policing, and gravel or grass is the same sort of thing. So you don't have to worry about that. If somebody wants to go a bit quick right through a corner and go into the gravel and try and get out of it, well, so be it. You pay the price for it. And I think that's a lesson to be learned with some of these new racetracks that have just got multi-runoff areas. Now, I know there's a lot to do with motorbikes and cars racing and all that sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, we talk about F1. We talk about F1 tracks, and as I say, Imola is one of those old school tracks through the trees. You pay the price if you go wide at most places. Why not? It's great because you as a viewer you can sit and watch it and you see what's going on. You see somebody spitting up the gravel. You know he's gone wide. You know there's a price to pay for that in lap time. So it's all sort of self-policing, really. It makes things so much easier. So, yes, I was pleased to see that. Monaco's a bit different when you get there. All you do is see, nuts and bolts and bits of wheels and wishbones and stuff going over the barrier if you get it wrong. But that's the discipline. You have to change. It's a discipline that every circuit brings to you, a new way of controlling it. So you don't have too much problem with using too much runoff area at Monaco because you pay the price pretty quickly.
And also Monaco a little bit easier these days to work at perhaps than it was back in the days you first went there in the 70s when the teams were all scattered all over the place, weren't they?
Yeah, well, we were down in a car park underneath an awning. As you go down, the racetrack goes down the hill from Mirabeau and turns right into the tunnel. You turned left there, and it was a big car park. We used to be parked there, so you would you drive the car around to the pit lane. Just that's the way you did it. You do practice and you drive the car back again. So I've had the pleasure of driving a Formula One car around Monaco, not in anger as such, except for once I had to take Ricky Von Opel's Brabham back. He said he had a misfire after the morning warm up, and I was authorised by Bernie to give it some welly on the way from the pit lane back up the to Casino and down from Casino just to see if the misfire was okay, if we'd fixed it. So that was interesting. No helmet, no nothing, hair blowing in the wind, but bloody quick, even at that speed they're quick. So quite exciting at Monaco for a Formula One driver. Quite exciting for a Formula One mechanic driving a Formula One car around Monaco, but those days are long gone.
Yeah, very, very different times, but still an iconic weekend. Well, as ever, we'll leave the floor open for a topic of your choice for the first part of this podcast. So what's on your mind, Gary?
Well, it's just the developments of the teams. Obviously, we talk about reaching the sort of point of very little left, and I suppose you could say that Red Bull, having had their domination in 2022, 2023, And so far in 2024, they haven't looked too bad. It's been harder for them. But that's always going to be the way. You know, they've been, as I say, standing on the top step of the ladder. Not many more steps to go before you land on the roof. Whereas the rest have been playing catch-up. So for Red Bull, you know, to find lap time now is going to be tough. I'm sure there's a few little areas in there to tidy up. But in doing that, you can also lose yourself a little bit because you're pushing the extremes right to the limit. You're not taking these big, large but conservative steps within the knowledge of what you have. You're going to have to push the limits a little bit further into the grey area of what you don't really quite understand. And I think that's sort of what's happening to them. They're trying to, you know, keep on top of the game, but the return value is very, very low and the risk level is very, very high. So I think we're seeing that, and that last two races haven't been, you know, Red Bull stamped as such. Competition has closed the gap up, and that's good because it changes the pressure on Red Bull as well. When the competition's close, Red Bull can't relax really. They need to find something, so they need to keep pushing. And in doing that pushing, as I say, they could fall into some sort of negative area, which is hard to understand because as a team, you know, you feel that you've got a good grasp on how the car works. But suddenly, if you're not getting any return out of it in the wind tunnel or in your thought pattern on setup, then you have to change a little bit your direction to try and find that next stage of where you can find a return. And as long as the other teams are nipping at their heels, that pressure's on all the time. If there was, you know, a bit more, a couple of tenths, 3 tenths or whatever of a gap as there was in the past, then Red Bull could afford to sort of not take too many risks, still keep the ball rolling in the same direction as to the philosophy of how their car works. So interesting times coming, I think. We've got Monaco, very different type track. Obviously in the past we've seen that Ferrari have been very good around Monaco with their engine characteristics, their car characteristics, and Charles Leclerc's not too frightened of the barrier. And again, we've got Montreal then, which is a high-speed track as such with big braking episodes and change of direction. So these are different tracks, these next two coming up. So it'll be interesting to see who can keep their head up because that's what you got to do, is just keep your head up. And we saw in Imola, you know, Red Bull started badly. At the end of the day, they were standing on the top step of the podium. So Max Verstappen is pretty good at getting the best out of what he's got. And still to this point in time, it's good enough.
Well, the interesting thing with Red Bull is obviously one of the big struggles they had was getting the front end into the car for Imola. And I think even though they did win, that was never completely got on top of it. Certainly wasn't where Max Verstappen wanted. And I think they ended up with a car that was almost at times getting too loose at the rear, even for him. And nobody's got greater tolerance for that than him. But there is a point where you can't just do it. And I think that's why Perez had so many troubles. Now, it's interesting because that could just be the nature of Imola because the ride heights have to be a bit higher because of all the curb riding, just the nature of the circuit. But is there a danger that Red Bull's starting to get into the area where it gets big diminishing? Well, you can't really have big diminishing returns. Well, it is a game of diminishing returns because the front end of the car is always the weak point given the way the downforce is generated. So getting that turn-in is the main challenge. And you could end up trying to look for more performance, but you create a limitation there and keep hitting up against it. So I guess that's the question as to whether we're seeing something that was just track specific at Imola, whether we're seeing Red Bull going a bit the wrong way, or it's just Red Bull bouncing off the ceiling of where they can go with these cars. And of course, that latter one is most interesting for the fight at the front because ideally we want Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, as many as possible, all at a similar level.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the developments that they did, obviously there's a bit of a change in front wing profile, trailing edge. That's a normal thing really for the downforce level that you're running, trying to optimise the balance. But you got to be a little bit careful with that, and especially at Imola because down into Aqua Minerale, it's down into Aqua Minerale, it's downhill braking, and it's downhill braking into Ravazza. So those characteristics change the car dramatically. You know, if you have a car that's borderline on nervous rear end braking, and or got a good front end grip, those two corners will stand out and make the rear end very nervous because, the downhill braking, the weight transfer, all that stuff just compromises it. So although Imola is, a conventional racetrack as such, and you talk about the curbs and running the car higher, that's relatively all the same for everybody. That's a characteristics the same for all the cars out there. But the thing about it, those two braking points downhill can change the characteristics. So suddenly you might not be able to run the front end grip that you need for the rest of the track because Ravazza and Acqua Minerale make the rear of the car too nervous. So everything's a compromise, I, again, in my article I did a review on it, the bits and pieces, the rear brake ducts and the turning vanes that they've changed for Imola, again, that's something that generates load directly onto the rear tyre contact patch, so that when you hit the brake pedal and the car does change attitude, normally it unloads the rear tyre. And that brake duct and those turning vanes are very good for the amount of load they generate, which is not a lot, but it's on the rear tyre constantly. It doesn't have a sort of time lag. So you've got to be very careful with that compromise. It's a big thing now, that those brake ducts and how they work and the amount of development and the amount of downforce they produce. Because as I say, it's right on the tyre contact patch. You would give up a little bit on the chassis to have a little bit more from the brake duct if you could, because it will be more stable. So those sort of developments are a little bit, how would you say, difficult to simulate, I suppose. But, they obviously got on top of it all, and only time will tell whether it's really was an Imola characteristic due to the tyres, due to the track surface layout, the whole thing. But I think, as you say, they are reaching that terminal position of performance. I don't think there's many seconds left in it. I think tenths of a second are probably there, but that's all relative to everybody else, So it's the old development game. You just got to keep going and try and make sure that you understand the developments you're putting on the car.
And Sergio Perez's struggles were quite telling. Very much Imola was an outlier weekend for him. Obviously, qualifying didn't go well, fell in Q2, came back to 8th, but there's very little you can do once you're out of position at Imola. You can only really gain a small amount of places because of the traffic and the difficulty of overtaking. But I thought his FP3 off was quite telling, because the way I saw that, yes, he ended up spinning because he hit the curbs too hard, but for me, that all started at corner entry when just the rear just went and he almost over-rotated on that initial turn-in. And that's why he hit the curbs in the way he didn't want to. So that's a little bit worrying for Perez, isn't it? Because we know that that's a condition of car that he doesn't get on with well. And although it's a one-off so far, he'll be hoping that that's not going to be a set of characteristics he continues to encounter, or he could end up with a bit of a mid-season slump again.
Well, I think we've seen on many occasions that Red Bull's development direction hasn't always suited Perez. So, that's a sort of fairly common ground that Max gets the best out of it fairly quickly. Now, that spin, hitting that first curb at the Variante Alta, that's what you have to do to get the car to rotate, because you just launch the car basically off that one. The next thing you need is the car to land and grip and not bounce, because if it bounces once, you sort of haven't got the grip to sort of get the car turned in the opposite direction. And it's a compromise of how hard you hit the curb, how the car lands and how it grips. And, it is one of those things where you come into the corner, and we saw in the race, I think Charles Leclerc aborted it once and went across the grass. It's one of those things where you commit to where you are. You're either going to try and make it around the corner, or you have to commit and go across the grass. And it's that difficult commitment is in a thousandth of a second, I suppose you might call it. And obviously Sergio just hitting that curb and the car bouncing. There is a point in time when there's no wheels on the ground, so you just got the momentum, the cornering force, taking the car to where it's going to go to, and then it has to land and grip, pick up all that tyre grip again. And obviously that's just a balancing act, between it happening and not happening. I think it was sort of caught him out a little bit, but it was a bit of a daft sort of off. It just looked very innocuous, really. It just bounced and then went straight on into the tire barrier. So it was just sort of like the end result was a nothing. But on the way there, it was just the attack in the corner and getting the right attitude on the car that really made it happen. But as I say, the end result from when he left the track to hitting the barrier was just like, well, that's really stupid, isn't it?
Yeah, and he'll be looking forward to getting onto the streets of Monaco, where, of course, he's gone well in the past. I think hopefully a much better weekend for him there. Well, let's talk about some of the chasing pack now, Gary. Loads of developments at Imola, and we saw a little bit of everything, didn't we? Because we saw McLaren, Mercedes and Aston Martin and Ferrari all having various types of upgrades or benefiting from upgrades in Miami. So McLaren confirmed that its Miami upgrade worked a treat. Mercedes and Ferrari, sort of a gentle positive step, but nothing transformative. And then Aston Martin seemed to be a real struggle. So should we start with Aston Martin, because it was a significant package for them. Dan Fallows, their technical director, called it sort of their biggest one so far. But it was still a tricky car to drive. Fernando Alonso had trouble with it, and they're looking in danger of dropping into the back half of the field, aren't they? So, what do you make of the progress Aston Martin's having there? And are you convinced that they really know what their development trajectory has to be?
Well, I think we're seeing the same as we did last year, aren't we? Where, they started off the season last year, fairly strongly. And then it sort of tripped up really for them. And they had to sort of regroup a bit before the end of the season. And you would think during that period they would have learned the lessons of the characteristics that make the car go faster, because that's what it was all about. This finding more downforce, finding a few kilograms more downforce here and there, it's all well enough, but it's got to be downforce the driver can use. And I think McLaren and Aston Martin are sort of the opposite extremes here, whenever it comes to it. I think what they've done for Imola, from Aston Martin's point of view, made the car worse. Fernando Alonso is very long in the tooth and whatever. He's had a lot of experience. He doesn't crash the car, like what happened at Imola. Those are not mistakes he makes, especially in FP3. That's not the sort of thing that happens. He knows the responsibility he has, especially in FP3, to just, save that tenth of a second. But up to that point in time, he had run harder tyre, I believe it was, and he hadn't really exploited with the softer tyres and obviously trying to get a lap time out of it, because he was reading that the car wasn't doing what he wanted to do, and he just wanted to use the time to try and get the car better. But then obviously the crash, that sets you back. Before you know it, you're chasing yourself. But the crashes happen for a reason. You can have a crash in a good car just because you're right on the limit all the time. But when you're looking at lap times of 12th, 15th or whatever, and you crash, then you're driving something that's difficult to understand. So I think, again, they've led themselves down a garden path where their development direction doesn't really suit the driver getting more confidence in the car. The car must be a bit nervous to drive or a bit on the edge, and that's what leads to the incidents and accidents, really. But it is incidents, I suppose you might call it. So I think they've gone the wrong direction. They need to scratch their head again and have a look and see why, because there is a reason for it there somewhere. Characteristics, the aerodynamic characteristics that they've improved, in their opinion, for the development package for Imola, has gone in the wrong direction. So they need to look at that very closely and see how they can read it and see if they can understand that reasoning and obviously rectify the situation.
And the interesting thing with Aston is obviously they struggled a bit with the characteristics they were generating last year, and as you've alluded to, similar sort of thing this year. The thing that is interesting about their kind of messaging is, if, for example, you listen to what McLaren say, obviously when things are going well, it's easier to be positive and say this, that, but Andrea Stella will say something is going to happen down the line, and it does at the moment. Whereas even with Aston, they sort of downplay the struggles, but there doesn't seem to be a really clear messaging. And that, to me, suggests not great certainty about exactly where they are with things, and they expect things to work, and they're not. And obviously, you've been in a position of being a technical director trying to explain developments that might not be working, and you're always very open with the media trying to explain it, but you can't explain it to people on the outside if you don't understand it on the inside. And I do wonder if there's a few little details that are just eluding them there, and then where exactly that problem might stem from is, I guess, the big challenge for them.
Well, yeah, I think it's all part of the same parcel. You know, if you're not truthful with yourself, you're not truthful with anybody. And I think it's very easy to think that, you know, we just missed the setup by a half a millimetre front ride height, or, you know, whatever. And that's, I think, where Andreas Seidl, you know, at McLaren isn't accepting that. He understands enough and knows enough to know that it's not just in that final little bit of a twist on that left-hand nut on the front suspension. You know, it's more to it than that. It's the characteristics of the car. And if you get the characteristics of the car better, the driver will find performance and he will make less errors, less mistakes. And I think, as I say, whenever you listen to Andreas speaking or to Dan Fallow speaking, the difference is that one is just saying it as it is. He's saying it from what he sees, as opposed to what he thinks he sees. I think Dan's saying it from what he thinks he sees, that the developments are all better. Wind tunnel wise is saying it's better, but it doesn't go quicker on the track. And that's the bit he's not seeing. And that's like sort of a team working in two different areas. You got a race team that's building the car, or you got a race team that's building the car for the circuit and setting it up and running the car, and you got a development team and design team back at Branch that's designing and building the car. And the two of them aren't really, how would you say, united, I suppose is the best way of putting it. You need to be united, because that's one of the sort of areas. I went through the same thing, where you know, there's a grey area. There's always something you could have done better at the racetrack, but you've got to really be honest with yourself to say, would that something better have been really a positive? You know, might have made it a little bit better, but would it really have covered our problems? And, you know, we don't want to criticise Mercedes at all for the last 2.5 years, or whatever it is, but they've been doing the same as that for quite a long time. You know, the talk I've heard all of the time from, especially from Toto, who's, you know, he's not the technical director of the company. He's a team principal. But that's, you know, it's just talk. You have to go out and do it. You can talk forever if you want, but the stopwatch doesn't lie. So at the end of the day, you know, Aston Martin need to go back and look at what they put on the car, why they made the decision that was better, what that better meant, and look closely at it and say, what we thought was better is actually worse. So how do we regroup here? Because that's what you've got to do. Sometimes you've got to admit, you find a new front wing, much better. It produces much better downforce. Put it in the car, the driver makes more mistakes, more errors. You're doing your speed runs for downforce, the front wing's developing more downforce. Yes, all quite good. But at the end of the day, you just need to analyse it and say, there's something happening here that isn't consistent enough. You know, if a driver goes out with one wing on and does 5 laps and doesn't make a mistake, puts your new wing on and goes out and, you know, one corner every lap he makes a mistake, there's something wrong with it. You have to be, you know, open-minded about it all. It's impossible not to be open-minded. So that's the area where really you got to redress and just make sure you understand how the characteristics of the car has changed.
Well, at the other end of the scale, we've got McLaren, who obviously are working very, very well. And Andreas Stella has talked to the upgrade correlating with the expectation, but actually yielding even more lap time than expected. And that has to be proof that this team really does know what it's doing, doesn't it, in terms of the upgrade programme? And it has been the case for the past 12 months or so. Are you as convinced by them as I am? As you say, the stopwatch doesn't lie, so that's one big tick for them, but they just seem to get it, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, on face value, it's not just this season. Last year, they started the season, they had a poor car, and they talked about updates coming in Austria and, you know, whatever through the season, and they brought them, and they went better, they improved. And so obviously they got their confidence in the direction of their developments. And this is what I'm saying. It's about the sort of philosophy of what direction your developments are taking you. That's the important thing. And McLaren seem to be on top of that because, you know, you can find peaky downforce and the driver, it'll bite the driver at some point in time. Peaky downforce is not with you all the time. You need to find driver usable downforce. And driver usable consistency, even more than just driver usable downforce. So it's the characteristics of the car that you want to try and get on top of. And if you can improve that, then the driver will find you more lap time. And we've criticised Lando Norris in the past for making mistakes, and he made quite a few. And I think that's just showing you the car leads to those mistakes. If you can get the car to have a more stable characteristic, then those mistakes diminish. So at the end of the day, I think McLaren do have a good handle on the direction they need to take their car. But they're getting close to Red Bull now, very close to Red Bull. So, again, it'll be diminishing returns for them. I don't see them just leapfrogging Red Bull and keeping going. I see them, reaching the sort of pinnacle with Red Bull and competition being pretty tough, as we've seen in the last two races. That Imola race was a bit of nip and tuck. As I say, I think in the middle of the race, I think that probably Lando learned a little bit that he needed to find another 1/10 of a second per lap. And if he could have found that for 10 laps, suddenly he'd have been on Verstappen's tail whenever Verstappen's tyres were starting to cry enough. So, it's all characteristics of how you drive the car. And when you drive the car, you can't afford to give up lap time in the middle of the race just because it's a little bit more comfortable and you're looking after the tyres a little bit better. Because when the opportunity does open up for you late in the race, you've given up too much. So I think as far as McLaren are concerned, every race is a new event. They've got two strong drivers. I think they have developed the car in the last 2 years in a positive direction. Every bit they've put in the car has given them a step in the right direction. I think whenever they started this year, I wasn't as keen on what they'd done from the end of last year on the car. And I think that showed initially because it's all changed now. So I think that's a good trend because they might have made a few errors for the beginning of 2024 in what they did with the car. And it's as important to learn what's not good as to learn what is good. So I think they're bouncing quite nicely at the moment. They're reacting to learning quite well, and I think they'll be a force to be reckoned with, the next few races.
How about Mercedes? They're very much in no man's land now, aren't they? They have edged ahead of Aston Martin, so fourth best car probably now, but they are behind the McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull top three. Now, I had a few updates in Miami, a few more in Imola, and they seem to work okay, nothing transformative. Do you see any signs that they're at least going in the right direction? Now, they do seem to at least be saying this is where our car is. We've just now got to put some serious development on it to get anywhere.
Yeah, but I've heard that for 2.5 years, really, I suppose. They're a team, their standing is enormous, 2014 to 2021, they were right there, winning everything and dominating everything and just impossible to beat as such. And then suddenly it all changed a little bit. I think we saw 2021, the competition with Red Bull become pretty tough. So even with the same set of regulations, and Toto Wolff would tell you that the changes to the back of the floor were to hurt Mercedes and help Red Bull for the 2021 regulations. And then obviously into 2022, the ground effect regulations came in, they again lost themselves a little bit. But at all points in time, when the season's starting, as far as they're concerned, they had a rocket ship. And then at the beginning of the year, it was a bit of a shock. And I think they took far too long to realise where they really were. As I've said many, many times, the most important thing is to find where you are consistently and then let it all unfold from there. Now, again, in Imola, we saw, I think, Friday, first practice, I think George Russell was fastest or, right up there. So there's obviously something there that tends to lead them astray a little bit because they can't keep it up. So they have to understand why in the early parts of practice they're very competitive and the drivers are saying, oh yeah, the car feels really good, to come qualifying in the doldrums. They are where they are. And I think 6th, 7th, behind Red Bull, or at least one Red Bull, behind probably 2 McLarens and probably 2 Ferraris. That's where they sort of sit. I think ducking and diving with Alonso and the Aston Martin if the car was good. But, whenever you see Tsunoda coming up there and doing a good job, you have to sort of say, for any team it is possible to dig themselves out of it. And Mercedes, from the background of their background from 2014 on to 2021, they don't look as though they can dig themselves out of it. Now they're saying, yes, we understand the car now and we just got to do these changes. Just stop talking about it and do it. It can be done. Obviously, within the budget cap, you have to do what you can do. But McLaren are showing you can change the car dramatically within the budget cap, or hopefully within the budget cap. Aston Martin, Ferrari, they're all doing fairly major developments. New floor, side pods, engine cover, front wing are arriving at the tracks. And is there something wrong with Mercedes that they can't do that? Because, that's what they should be doing. And they should work. That's the thing about it. If you know what it is, fix it. Because you just have to get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they need their McLaren moment, don't they? And when they do, the form will transform, and then they'll get some decent results, I imagine. But yeah, until they do that, given the past few years, that's where they are. And Ferrari as well was obviously much talked about before the weekend, and they had a fair few parts, but pretty much they were in the same place they always were. They're about 0.3 off on qualifying pace. They were the third quickest car there, so it feels a little bit like they're treading water there. So it's not good, it's not bad, that's just exactly where they were in terms of development, within the with the caveat that maybe Imola wasn't the best circuit for them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because Imola, obviously, it's a home track. They really wanted to perform well there. So, yeah, they put a lot of effort into it. The car, the developments on the car were, how would you say, tidy developments that looked like they were in the right direction as far as the radiator intake's concerned, and, optimizing that a little bit better. It was just small stuff that was, sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, I suppose you might call it. But I think what we've got to remember is that, at the end of the day, Red Bull were not happy with what they started in Imola with. So the whole weekend, I think, was skewed a little bit as far as that was concerned. And, Ferrari picked up the gauntlet fairly early on the Friday and the Saturday to do a good job. And that can sometimes end up, leading you astray as far as the depth you have to go to. So it was one of those sort of situations, I think, getting the best performance out of the car and getting the best performance out of the tyres around Imola was not an easy task. Their developments, I think, are visually, and from a little bit I know about the design direction that you would take, I think they're pretty decent. They're neat, tidy, and they've just optimised the car a little bit more. So I think we need to give them another chance without the I suppose the pressure of Imola might be one of those sort of things, and without the Red Bull tripping up, to really see where they are. Because if you start the weekend well on the Friday for all the teams, then you sort of benefit that a little bit, and that's what they need to sort of prove to us that they can do. They just need to start the weekend correctly, and then take it through the whole weekend completely, and we see where they are. Because I think Leclerc on the podium, it was pretty good, but Piastri suffered because of the penalty, so that might not have happened if Piastri had a straight race and started second on the grid. Things would have been different. So I think we need to wait and see what happens and give them all time. All of them need time. As I say, you arrive at a load of developments. Strange weekend. Tyres were a little bit strange in Imola, so give them more time and let's see where they get to.
Do you think we've seen enough to conclude that F1 is inching towards that much promised convergence at the front? Because the early stages of this season suggested that Red Bull were going to have it almost all their own way. But now we're at a point where McLaren and hopefully Ferrari on occasion too can hope to stay ahead of Red Bull if they get ahead in a race, as we saw in Miami, albeit with Verstappen having the damage. It does seem to be getting a little bit more likely for, even if they don't go out and blitz Red Bull, which obviously we don't really want to see anyone blitzing anyone. We want similar performance at the front. Is it getting towards something a little bit more exciting, and therefore should people perhaps back away from the expectation that 24 and 25 are just going to be more of the same endlessly?
Well, I think it is getting closer at the front. I think it's one of those sort of things where, as you say, they're at 24 and 25, relatively they will be, more or less the same car. In other words, your development for 24 will be able to be, run into 25, because it's going to be the last year of these regulations. So I think that we will see developments continuing as 24 goes on, because as I say, it's developments for the next year and a half, or whatever it be, 35 races or something. So you're not wasting it, and you're not going to throw it away at the end of the year. So I think because of that, we will see convergence at the front. I'm hoping that we can see Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. And then you've got a bit of a blink there. I'm not sure where Aston Martin really stand. I'd like to see Aston Martin in that bunch. And then at the back of that bunch, then there's other people nipping at their heels, like Hülkenberg in the Haas, Tsunoda in the RB. They're nipping at the heels of that big bunch, so they could be in that mix, and that would make Formula One so much better. Formula One, from the front to the back of the grid, is closer than it's really ever been, I suppose you might call it. It's just the fact that 20 years ago, the distance between first and second on the grid was probably the same as now the distance between first and 10th, at least, probably 10th, first to 15th. So it's a lot closer. It's a lot harder to get the best out of it. But that's because all the tools that the teams have, they're all at the same level now. In the past, 15, 20 years ago, they weren't. Some teams had a lot of stuff, a lot of tools to optimise, and other teams didn't. Whenever we used to go to the track in the 90s, you stuck your finger up to see which way the wind was blowing. And now you don't have to do that. So it's one of those sort of situations, I think, where it should converge. I think it is converging. And obviously with Adrian Newey going from Red Bull, as I say, there's lots and lots of people there. I'm sure there's lots of good people there. But it still means there's a sort of an empty desk. That somebody has to fulfill that empty desk. So that's a bit destabilising there. And the one thing that we're seeing with McLaren is they're strengthening their team. So I believe we'll see this season, come the second half of this season, going to a race meeting and not knowing who's going to be on pole, or not knowing who's going to win the race. And that's really what we want to do. And that might be out of 5 teams, probably 4, but definitely 3.
Yeah, well, I think there's every chance we're going to see more McLaren and Ferrari wins, as well as more Red Bull wins in the coming season, which is something to look forward to. Well, as ever, let's move on to our questions section. Thanks very much to everyone who sends questions in for Gary. And as I always say, there's no stupid questions. And in fact, we always have very, very good, very interesting questions sent in for this podcast. If you've got something you'd like to throw at Gary about F1 ancient or modern, something you've always wanted to understand, some detail, some idea for the future, anything on the table, as long as it's relatively technical in nature, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. You can either write the question, as most do, or we do like people who send voice notes, including who they are, so we can cut that into the podcast. The first question for you, Gary, is from Jamie Start, who says, this is another example this season of different cars performing better or worse on different compounds in quali and the race. I don't remember this being as stark an issue in previous seasons. What's causing things like the McLaren underperforming on mediums but overperforming on hards, or Ferrari having great pace on mediums but unable to fire fresh softs up in qualifying?
Well, I think, Jamie, it's always really been a bit of a problem because it's a balance thing. If you can imagine, that as you soften the tyre compound, let's say you start with a hard, when you would go to the medium, you'd generate a little bit more understeer because the car, when you go back on the throttle, you push the front that little bit more. So you'll see the teams put a little bit more front wing in the car. And the same then when you go to the soft tyres, you'll, again, generate a little bit more understeer normally. But because of the way the regulations are, you can't change the car dramatically between going out at the beginning of qualifying. Other than front wing and differential settings, brake balance, that sort of stuff. So I think it's down to the inherent balance of the car. If you were to spend a couple of days and 10 sets of the same compound tyre, you would optimize your car around that tyre. And then when you change it to a harder or a softer tyre, you would end up with a slightly different characteristic. So it depends on what you're wanting to do. What we are seeing in the races at the moment is that the hard tyre is the race tyre, and you need to be able to have good warm-up characteristics and good durability, low degradation on the harder tyre, because that's normally the tyre that you would try to go a long distance on. And obviously then the softest tyre that Pirelli bring will be your qualifying tyre. So you need to know the offset switch between getting the soft tyre to get the fronts working, making them last a lap for qualifying, and then obviously going into the race, everybody starts in the mediums, which is middle of the road, and normally gets to the hard fairly quickly. Now we were seeing a couple of cars ran mediums, for a long stint at the beginning in Imola, and made it out, just a one stop because of long on the mediums, and then onto the hard. So it's one of those sort of situations where depends on your car as to what the characteristics are, and it will be different. But every car and every driver has the same problem. It's just a matter of really the balance of your car for a given tyre, and then knowing the sort of the delta and the front wing offset, and how to address it, how to drive it. The change between one and the other will always be a little bit different. It's not as though you can put, softs in the front and hards in the rear. The compound changes, and because the compound, it sort of defines itself. Whenever we say about hard compound, medium compound and soft compound, the soft compound tyres will always move that little bit differently as well, because they are genuinely a softer compound. So it's a softer bit of rubber. So there's those characteristics that the car needs to be able to operate with. And I think, we see McLaren have done a good job in that as well, as understanding it. They qualified well on the soft tyre, and they ran well on the hard tyre.
And the next question comes from Luis Dalgano, who says, given the revelations about the Williams being overweight, in Gary's experience, how long would it have taken Eddie Jordan in those circumstances to pitch a sponsorship deal to Slim Fast?
Well, yeah, Weight Watchers. It's one of those situations that this overweight thing, if you went in and looked at these cars into the garage, which we don't often see very much of, but there's just so much stuff on them. And that's all a team's decision as to what that stuff, is that stuff all necessary? And you have to balance it, because weight is just a given penalty. 10 kilograms of weight, 0.3 of a second. If we take an average on the grid, now that's three positions on the grid for sure. No matter where you are on the grid, the front of the grid to the back of the grid is knocking on the door 2 seconds. So, 1/10 of a second per position, and it's even closer at times, relatively. So, they shouldn't be overweight, because that's just a basic failure at the beginning of the season. And no matter what, systems you have for building the cars, whatever, you have to accommodate. You have to accommodate the fact that you do a huge spreadsheet just on the weight of the car as you're going along, and you find areas that you sometimes have to forgo and not have all that stuff on the car, because weight will just make you go slower. So yeah, Eddie would have been out there beating me up. Not me for being overweight, which I am probably a little bit, but the car being overweight, because he would have understood that is just plain giving everybody else some lap time. And whether he'd have got a deal out of Slim Fast, I'm sure he would have done, because he was pretty good at that. But I don't know. It's just one of those sort of things. I'm disappointed for a team like that. For any team, I'm disappointed for the car being overweight because it is just lap time you're giving to everybody else.
But it all seems to be part of the wider thing for the team because the monocoque itself is 14 kilos lighter than last year, but because they cause themselves so many problems pushing so hard with the monocoque, they've had all sorts of other problems, and the weight gain elsewhere is the release valve because they haven't had time to do all the other stuff properly because they tried to do so many new parts. So again, their argument is this is all part of that wider progression the team needs to make. So I guess it all comes down to the question of, provided it's avoided with next year's car, that's okay, but you don't want to see these problems repeating and repeating.
Yeah, the problem I have with that one, Ed, is you're always working from where you are. And, they may have been overweight for the last 10 years and getting better and better at it. But, if they started these regulations with these new cars in 2022 and the car was massively overweight, I'm sure that 2024 car is lighter than the 2022 car. It should be. So they may still be overweight because of that, but you only work from where you are. So 2025 will only be, just a constant weight reduction from 2024. So you've got to, at some point in time, you've got to take an overall view of the whole thing and say, right, okay, are we building our cars to the regulations as they're written? And one of the regulations that's written in the book is the minimum weight limit. Now, going back again lots of years, we had the weight limit at whatever it was, 620 kilograms, including the driver. But, without ballast in the car, we were building them at 560 and putting ballast on the car. Now, I'm not saying you could do that now because of the old steps and safety or whatever, but you can still build a car to, have 10 kilograms of room for ballast, I suppose you might call it, just to trim the car that little bit, as opposed to always be fighting to take weight off the car just to get down to the weight limit. So the regulations are written in such a way, the rear wing is X height and X distance from the rear axle. If your system doesn't allow you to build a car with the rear wing X distance and X height from the rear axle, then you've got it wrong. And it's the same with the weight. The regulations define the minimum weight. That doesn't mean you can't be 10 kilograms lighter and then ballast it up. But it does mean that if you're 10 kilograms heavier, you're going to go slower.
And the next question comes from Chris McDonald. If Teams knew Monaco wasn't going to be a part of the season, would the cars be faster at other tracks? Put another way, does Monaco make the cars slower through gear ratio, steering lock, etc.?
I don't think Monaco makes the cars slower. I'll go through the bits and pieces. I mean, the Monaco downforce levels are something that you add extreme bits on them onto, let's say, a Hungary or a Singapore or a high downforce normal setup. You add on extreme bits, i.e. gurney flaps and bits of extensions on the front wings and so on and so forth. So I don't think you take Monaco into account for the design of the car. As far as the gears are concerned, the cars have a defined 8-speed gearbox. 8th gear needs to cope with Mons top speeds, and first gear needs to cope with some slow corners. And I don't think the difference in Monaco hairpin relative to some of the slow corners. I don't even know whether you'll use first gear around Monaco hairpin because these things have got so much torque that it's, it doesn't really matter anymore. You got the electrical torque, so you're not through a corner like that. You're not maximising through engine power. It's through the electrical torque. So I don't think there'll be any real compromise that would make not having Monaco make the cars faster for other circuits. Steering lock, yes, you have to cater for it around the hairpin at Monaco. Normally we would have catered for a 14 degrees of wheel lock for a normal design of suspension, and then you would have increased that a bit with maybe a special wishbone or a special shroud on the wishbone, or cutting a bit out of the shroud on the wishbone just to get yourself up to 18, 19, 20 degrees maybe for the hairpin. So it's one of those sort of situations. The hairpin, Monaco goes left. It's only one way at Lowe's hairpin, as it used to be called. So, you might have to compromise that left hand top or bottom wishbone a little bit, but you wouldn't do that as a norm. You'd do that as a sort of special for Monaco. So I don't see it making much difference to the cars relative to the rest of the races. I think Monza might influence cars a little bit more. If you didn't have Monza, you wouldn't worry so much just about that out-and-out efficiency from the car. But again, it comes from the fact of running a smaller, much smaller rear wing at Monza. So there's a big variation of all the normal tracks. And if you took Monaco and Monza away from which is the slowest and the fastest circuit, away from the season, I don't think you'd really design your car that much different. Mr. Average is still in the middle there somewhere. If you took all the corner speeds and straights from all the other tracks.
The next question comes from Don Anderson. We have addressed this one on the F1 podcast, but we thought it was well worth you addressing it as well, because it's been sent in for the tech show as well. So Don Anderson asks, now that the 2026 chassis rules are coming into view, is there any chance that the FIA can address the most dangerous safety condition on the cars? This is, of course, the unprotected forward surface of the rear wheels. An overwhelming majority of car-to-car contact involves this area, none worse than Zhou Guanyu's hideous crash at Silverstone in 2022. Always Practical IndyCar has fixed this. Why can't F1?
Well, I wouldn't jump in there, Don, and say that Always Practical IndyCars has fixed this, because the pod around the rear tyre of an IndyCar, again, very very similar to Formula E in a way. It's an aerodynamic pod. Structurally, obviously it depends on the contact as to whether or not it's going to be strong enough to stop another car getting involved in interlocking wheels. I think it's something that, that could be looked at in conjunction with this research that's going on for the wet weather control of the spray of the tyres, because there's no reason not to think about it together. It's one of those sort of situations where basically if you've got something that will protect that wheel a bit and stop the interlocking wheels, then there is a chance that you could also affect the spray coming off the rear tyres, which is what the following driver gets hit with, basically. So it's there is room to say that there is a potential there for a change. Now we've always had this Formula One's open wheel racing. That's what it should be. That's how it is. So perhaps it could be done to some level. And still keep it as open wheel racing, but you need to put a lot of research into it to see what was a good enough wet weather spray control, and B, structurally enough. Because the problem with things, and we've seen it actually just in Formula One in general, the respect for a driver's respect for his survival has diminished dramatically over the years. Back in my early days in the 70s in Formula One, if you crashed one of these things at high speed, you definitely get taken away in an ambulance, and it might be a one-way trip. Whereas these cars currently, and we see it very often, you can crash them and dust yourself down and get out, and you're okay. So it's very easy to sort of get yourself into a situation where you have a car that's very safe, and then there's very little respect. And I think we're seeing that now with the wheel banging that we do see going on now and again, and the chopping and whatever of one driver and another driver. That's just come from the cars being safe and really and truthfully, nobody, very low chance of getting hurt or dramatically hurt in one of these cars at the moment.
And the final question comes from Paul Hodgen, who says, why are the teams allowed so much simulator time? Surely to make it more competitive, it would be best if all the teams were not allowed one. You could make the practices an hour and a half long to make sure all safety matters were taken care of, but with the teams only having the data from the practices, would this make it more competitive? So this question's about, I think, driver in loop simulators particularly.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this same question before, really. It's just one of those sort of situations where you sort of can't go backwards, it's very difficult to step backwards. Just taking an example, that my nephew has just got his pilot's license, and he's, flying planes now with passengers. But every minute that he's got free, he's in the simulator, just trying to makes sure he understands everything and goes through all the consequences of having to react to a situation. And that's the same with the simulators, for Formula One. It's one of those sort of situations. Would it make it more competitive? I would rather, personally, I said this before, I would rather see the teams not get the performance data from the car as the weekend progressed. You get reliability data or safety data from the car, but not performance data. At the minute, the engineers are telling them, your front tyres are 10 degrees too cool, or your rear tyres are 20 degrees too hot, or the brakes are this, or the brakes are that. That sort of stuff really, back in the old days, the driver had to do that reading himself. And I just wish we could get there. And then if you didn't have that data, you wouldn't be able to feed it into a simulator over the weekend. We saw in Imola, taking that as an example, Red Bull started poorly, and Christian Horner credited their simulator drivers with the fix as the weekend progressed. They were at Red Bull and Milton Keynes, lapping Imola constantly, trying to find solutions to their problem. So it's a fine line. I think that if you didn't have that data to send back to the simulator, it would be better than not having the simulator. Because testing's been reduced dramatically, or actual circuit testings have been reduced dramatically. So allow the teams to prepare for the weekend on the simulator, but come the car leaving the pit lane on a Friday morning until Sunday night, there's you can have X channels, as I say, for reliability and safety. But the other ones of car performance, that's locked away until Sunday night. And then you can go back on Monday morning and you can run it and you can analyse where you went wrong, hopefully fix it for the next race. And that I think would make Formula One more competitive and potentially more random.
Yeah, certainly make it a little bit more reactive and based on what the team trackside old school style can do. So an interesting idea. Well, thanks very much for those questions, and thanks, of course, for the excellent answers. If you do have a question for Gary, send it to podcast@therace.com. That's the -race, podcast@therace.com. Well, we're going to turn our attention to Monaco now. So join us next time for more from Gary.
The Athletic.